Let's be honest. We all, government and simply citizens, have underestimated the disruptive charge of this pandemic exploded in China. Probably, we are still doing it. For weeks we have distractedly read what was happening in the Far East, without considering the fact that the virus could have traveled easily in a globalized world and reaching us. The European and US public opinions have behaved not differently during the onset of the Italian crisis. This collective removal phenomenon was accompanied by the government's initial hesitation to assume more restrictive containing measures similar to those adopted by China, aware of the enormous economic danger that they imply. Until a few days ago, the economic experts' forecasts shown a slowdown in the worldwide economy's first and second trimester, and a strong and rapid recovery in the second part of the year, according to the well-known V scheme. Today these forecasts appear unreasonably optimistic. As in a perfect storm, the crisis has contemporarily hit the worldwide offer and demand of goods and services. Meanwhile, flight stops, shops closure, people confined in their home, and other measures adapted, have resulted in a demand collapse. In the majority of cases it's a deadweight loss not determined by a postponement in expenditure decisions. When we'll strike out from this crisis, we won't go to the restaurant 10 times more to recover the lost dinners. All this was, in turn, the trigger of the financial bubble grown in the last decade. Those that at the beginning were just downward speculative maneuvers turned into, as the social alarm was growing, a sales avalanche. A valuation that seemed adequate a few weeks ago have rapidly halved, and as usual in this occasion, the available liquidity has soon resulted undersized respect of those required from assets liquidation. Mechanisms that feed our crisis are, firstly, part of the production interruption and consumption block during the most severe epidemic spreading period, first trimester in China and Italy, March and ongoing months in the rest of Europe and then USA. Entire sectors are still standing. Production, especially manufacture industry, depends and rely largely on international production systems, with components made in several different countries, which results in a very vulnerable framework, compared to the entire block of activity linked to the epidemic. Effects on the labor market are unemployment and decreasing salary, that might be compensated only in part by measures introduced by the different governments. Therefore, the predicted demand downturn will result in slowdown furtherly the production. Increasing health spending due to the emergency will hardly has expansive effects on the overall economy. In front of this recession, expansive economic policies are totally inefficient, and fiscal expansive policies or tax reliefs can produce only limited effects. Only an increase in public expenditure for purchasing goods and services for the creation of new economic activities can restart the economy. This is the reason why central banks, Fed in particular, have rushed and injected liquidity at zero cost in the markets, and have substituted market participants as counterparties in short-term refinancing operations, the so-called repo. So what is a tragedy for big business? The lack of liquidity due first to the economic downturn, and then to the collapse of private spending. For small and medium-sized businesses means failure, without hope. One can stand still for a month, but only if there is the prospect of starting to sell and buy again in the very short term. And do not think that in today's situation, due to a long cycle of low or negative inflation which can only be prolonged at this point, the states can replace private consumption, since they have been indebted in a frightening way, and probably to help healthcare, productive sectors and households, in the next 12 to 24 months, will increase their sovereign debt by at least half, if not twice as much. They will soon find themselves with the empty box. So far, there has been no specific event to trigger the crisis, such as the collapse of subprime mortgages in 2007, the failure of Lehman Brothers, and then the public debt crisis in Europe. The financial system has become very complex and vulnerable, and the crisis may erupt at some unexpected point. For example, bankruptcies of US health insurance companies facing the costs of the epidemic, the excess of private debt in the US in the face of a global recession, the European inability to change policies in the face of the expansion of the public debt of the most fragile states. Another mechanism intended to aggravate the crisis, the most dangerous one, is finance. Between February 19 and March 12 on the Wall Street Stock Exchange, the Standard & Poor's 500 index lost 25%. In London, the fall of the FTSE 100 index was 28%. Financial instability is set to increase, and has not been halted by new liquidity issues from the US Federal Reserve of $1.5 trillion or the European Central Bank, with just €120 billion for the whole of 2020, without interest rate cuts. The decision of the European Central Bank was accompanied by the disastrous statement of President Christine Lagarde: "We are not here to reduce spreads, it is not our job." The rise in interest rate spreads between Italian and German government bonds was immediate. Without a radical change of direction by European powers, the fragmentation of the euro area could become one of the effects of the epidemic. But Europe, too, has more than 500 million mouths to feed, and could suffer a terrible shock. The containment measures taken in almost all countries means that global demand will abruptly stop, and global supply chains will still be discontinued when factories around the world suspend operations. Europe is facing substantial stagnation, with a significant fall for fragile economies, such as Italy. The New York Times, speaking about Italy, but could have extended the discourse to Spain, France, etc., wrote that with the whole nation effectively quarantined, its closed industry and consumer spending reduced to nothing more than food and medicine, the economy is expected to contract by 3% this year. And according to other sources such as Confindustria, the General Confederation of Italian Industry, the 3% fall in GDP in 2020 is even extremely optimistic. According to estimates by the Industrial Studies Center, by the end of the year economy will fall by 6%, and there is a risk that the recession will turn into depression. Many Italian companies may be short of funds to repay their loans. This could weaken bank balance sheets to the point of crisis, and it is therefore likely that banks will have to be rescued. The prospects for Italy are particularly difficult. 20% of businesses have had strong negative effects. Whole sectors such as tourism will be affected well beyond the most acute moment of the epidemic. It will then weigh the depressive effect of falling incomes and demand. Moreover, with the production system weakened by a decade of recession and stagnation, income support measures may not result in increases in domestic production. After the crisis of 2008, the loss of 20% of production capacity became permanent. The risk for the country is that as a result of the epidemic, there will be a similar decline in the Italian economy. In the worst-case scenario, the debt-to-GDP ratio in the Netherlands would rise to 74% in 2021, a level that is equal to approximately half of that 150% that Italy could unfortunately reach already in 2020. Perhaps also for these forecasts, the Dutch government is among the most reluctant to grant solidarity funding in Europe to try to overcome the crisis induced by the effects of quarantine. The estimates to which we refer are those released by the Netherlands Bureau for Policy Economic Analyses, which has developed 4 scenarios on the possible economic consequences of the crisis. The softer scenario foresees a lockdown of only 3 months, with limited impacts on production capacity, thanks to the support measures of the Dutch government. In the middle of the 4 scenarios, 2 intermediate scenarios with 6-month restrictions with more or less serious consequences on the deterioration of the economic and financial sectors of the Netherlands. In its different imagined situations, the recession would be severe in 2020, GDP minus 5% or minus 7.7%, based on the gravity of the situation, but in both cases with GDP recovery in 2021. The worst-case scenario, the one considered extreme. The lockdown, even with various gradations, could last 12 months, and would result in a severe recession lasting at least a year and a half. In this case, GDP would fall by 7.3% in 2020, and continue to fall by 3% in 2021. The unemployment rate would rise to 9.4%, and the ratio between public debt and GDP, due to the numerous state bailouts that would become necessary, would rise to 61.7% in 2020, and 73.6% in 2021. And it is reasonable to think that citizens, at this early stage of the crisis and faced with catastrophic predictions that would lead their debt GDP to rise to only 73%, slow down to the hypothesis of solidarity with European countries such as Italy, which presented themselves to the new crisis with a public debt GDP ratio of 135%. Old story of the ant and the grasshopper. In part, maybe, yes. But mea culpa and future responsibilities should be weighed and shared. The scandalous tax evasion accepted in Italy is no less serious than the Dutch tax haven. If Europe falls, even in Holland paradise can wait. For the rest of the world, the collapse of economic activity could affect all sectors, as happened to the second largest economy on the planet, as draconian measures designed to contain it produced an unprecedented shock. China has witnessed a worrying rise in unemployment, from 5.2% to 6.3%, a tragedy for a country that has to feed 1.4 billion people. Although you still hear mainstream journalists talking about a Chinese economy falling by a few tenths of a percentage point, the most realistic prospect for 2020 is that the first recession GDP contraction since 1976 will occur, and that the blow will not be soft. At the New York Times, Cao Heaping, economist of the University of Beijing, said, "People cannot be persuaded to start spending again. The shock of demand could spread to East Asia, and then Europe and the United States and the world could face disaster. This is because stopping the world's second largest economy has proved easier than restarting. It could take months, if not longer, before the country is back on track." According to official statistics, most of the factories in China have been reopened after being closed after the Lunar New Year's holiday. But they are operating at 2/3 of their capacity. And it's not just a production problem. The cheap shops and luxury boutiques of Beijing and Shanghai are desolately empty, a clear sign that the shock due to the lack of consumption will continue for a long time after the quarantine. Deutsche Bank announced that US GDP could fall by 13% in the second quarter, that is to say, 1.5%, the strongest contraction during the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis. There is no such collapse in the historical series of the American economy. The financial crisis is destined to have its epicenter in the United States. In the 2008 crisis, stock exchanges had lost 50% of their stock prices, and similar losses could result from the epidemic in the United States. Last February, the Wall Street indices had reached more than twice the 2007 values, levels completely unjustified by the situation of the real economy. Above all, financial speculation was fueled by the widespread belief that with Donald Trump in the White House, policies to support finance and business and tax relief for the rich would allow Wall Street to continue its expansion. Recent expansionary measures by the US Federal Reserve were still moving in that direction, but this time financial markets do not seem to be stabilizing. Prior to the outbreak, the most likely scenario was a continuation of US financial expansion, artificially supported by fiscal and monetary policies, until the presidential election in November 2020. The constant of the US political economic cycle is that there is never a recession on the eve of the presidential vote, and that adjustments and crises occur the following year. In this scenario, Trump could easily have won on the wave of a good economy. Now the scenario has completely changed. The US's ability to control the epidemic is difficult to assess. The government's measures have so far been limited and confusing. The simultaneous, and probably record-breaking, economic downturn of the world's major economies is a fact that in reality does not allow forecasts to be made because it never happened. It is now certain that there will be a very deep recession this year. It is less clear what will happen from next year. The most positive scenarios predict that there will already be a recovery, even if in the best of cases the economies will not reach the economic levels of before. In the worst case, there will be a prolonged recession with disastrous consequences for society. I hope this video has helped you to understand better today's situation, and if you still have any questions, write them in a comment below. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.